Kia ora koutou katoa. Can you hear me? Yeah. Ko Jen Russell tōku ingoa. Thank you to the team for inviting me to give this talk. As I was saying, I work as a developmental paediatrician at Starship and also one of the few community paediatricians for the Auckland Metro region, but we've now become a national function. So it is lovely for me to be here and to talk to you about autism and ADHD. This is sort of my bread and butter work in developmental paediatrics. I do clinics at Starship and I do clinics in schools as well in specialist communities. Now, in 15 to 20 minutes, covering autism and ADHD is quite challenging. But I took a kind of growth mindset to this and I thought, this is a primary care challenge. You have 15 minutes. So, usually I have, an hour and 15 with patients. So what I focus this talk around is two things. One is the recognition of these conditions, and the second is referrals and what helps with referrals, which is where I'm sure you're all kind of feeling, yeah, that's the pressure point. So I'll try and give you some helpful information there. Now, despite this being a 15-minute talk, I can reassure you that I've put a disproportionate amount of time into preparing this. And the primary reason for that is because my own mother, who is a GP and quite an experienced one, is sitting here in the audience today. Yin Chan, she's just down here. She has a 4-digit MCNZ number. I'm really just looking for positive feedback at family lunch on Sunday. Thanks, Mum. My brother and I are both specialists. He's a rheumatologist, and we joke about how before we send clinic letters back to Mum, we double, triple, quadruple check them. I suppose that's just to lead in to say that before we begin, my colleagues and I, we really appreciate your mahi. We appreciate the pressures that we try to appreciate the pressures everybody is under. We really appreciate your mahi. And for me personally, I couldn't do what I do without you. So thank you for your care of my patients. I want to make two general statements before I get into recognition of these conditions. So the first is that, let me just check the time here. So the first is that autism and ADHD are common conditions. And according to the New Zealand Health Survey, autism affects 2% of children under the age of 15. I mean, the younger you go, the lower the prevalence because we diagnose it along the way. And for ADHD, it's 3%, and that is lower than international prevalence estimates are. So elsewhere, ADHD sits around 4%, sometimes higher, and it's heterogeneous. So in different communities, there's going to be a much higher prevalence of ADHD, and there are pockets within Auckland Metro region where a lot of children actually have ADHD. And so the key point here is that we're probably underdiagnosing ADHD in New Zealand children, particularly for girls. This is a theme in the overseas literature. So girls present often with inattentiveness, disorganization, distractibility, and they just don't get picked up quite as much. And it's put down to things like low self-esteem. So again, want to acknowledge there are difficulties in getting to assessment up and down the country, but we probably are underdiagnosing it. The thing is, they're so common, that when I make a diagnosis of autism and or ADHD, I tell young people that they're not alone and that it is very likely that in their school and in their year that there will be other young people with the same condition, so not to feel the stigma. And the second just general statement I wanted to make was that there's heavy overlap with neurodevelopmental disorders. So autism, ADHD, if you're looking at traits of this and you find that you're picking up as well some developmental coordination difficulties, and there's some pronunciation difficulties or language disorders or language apraxia, or they've got learning disorders, and maybe you're thinking there's a bit of dyslexia here, and it's all fuzzy, that is because that is the rule for neurodevelopment. Co-occurrence is the rule. So recognition of autism spectrum disorder. I actually really like the quick card that's in the health pathways. When you read the DSM-5 criteria, it's dense and technically worded. You can find this in the health pathways. I'm not going to read it out, obviously, but it is very good. It actually describes the traits of autism. And the key things that we see with autism, the two major criterion are social communication deficits and restricted repetitive behaviours. And the next slide, I'll talk to you a little bit about what that means for children. But with social communication deficits, this is the use of communication for social purposes. So the child might be speaking in a certain way, or they might be communicating with you, but maybe there's something odd about the social intention of it, or maybe there's something unusual about, and it's not socially doesn't meet your expectation. And there may be just difficulties in understanding social situations as well, and what is the right thing to do. And so the child or young person may feel overwhelmed or withdraw or be avoidant because that social interaction is very difficult for them and they're not certain how to interact. And young people with autism, one of the ways one of my patients described it to me was that it was as if they felt like an alien here on Earth. They just didn't, they just, that sense of feeling very different. There's also restricted repetitive behaviours, and that can look like very specific interests. You know, you can get them talking about Pokemon or Thomas the Tank Engine, but it's very difficult to shift their attention to elsewhere, and maybe they don't want to talk about anything else. And then odd movements or things that they do again and again purposelessly. So the question that I ask myself when I'm taking a history or when I'm interacting with a little child or a young person, is I ask myself, what would I have expected to see if this was a typically developing child of the same age? And even if the child has a language delay, you know, think about little children, even if they have a language delay, I still ask myself, am I seeing that social intention from this young child? Am I seeing that social awareness? Are they using their eyes? Are they using their face? Are they using gesture to overcome the fact that they don't have as much language? So in preschool children and school-age children, autism spectrum can present a little bit differently. And in preschool children, it's really the social communication things that we see that's probably the most noticeable for us, the reduced eye contact, they're not pointing, they just seem to be in their own world, and the parents tend to say, oh, we call to them, but they sort of ignore us. But actually what that is the child is in their own world. And I think it's quite interesting that when they gave autism a Māori name, they chose takiwatanga, which means in his or her own space and time. It sort of speaks to that idea that they're in their own world. And then when you go to interact with very small autistic children, there's just this reduced reciprocity there. So, it may not be that you can't have a to and fro conversation because they don't have the language to do that, but you can have a to and fro interaction. And in that to and fro interaction, you find that they don't reciprocate as you would expect, or perhaps in their reciprocation that there's something unusual about that. And if they go to daycare or preschool, most children before they go to school they might not show much interest in other children and not develop the kind of friendships that you'd expect. And by age 4, typically developing children are showing an interest in other children and even starting to develop specific friendships that then grow into kind of best friend friendships by the time they're 5. So if you're not seeing that interest in other children by around age 4 or 5, that would be unusual too. In school-age children, slightly different. Again, it's that difficulty sustaining to and fro conversations with some reduced eye contact. Often with young people who are verbal, they're on the autistic spectrum, they're verbal, often very smart. I find that they redirect the conversation through their parents. So you talk directly to the young person and then they look at their mum or dad and then they give the answer to their mum or dad relays it back to them or says, speak to the doctor. It's that, and you have to think to yourself, okay, this young person is 12, 13. That's not typical. Even though they've got the ability to communicate, they're not communicating with me in a way that meets the social expectations for this situation. And then they may have sort of sensory things that they need to do. They may come home from school, spin things, twirl, lie down for a bit, put their face in their pillows. They may need to have things very ritualized and they may become upset. Sometimes it's difficult for them to shift off talking about a subject that they're highly interested in. And I've had young people who want to talk to me about trampolines, and not just trampolines, but specific types of trampolines, or security cameras and specific security cameras, or flags, or whatever it is. And they might have just a very select number of highly specific interests. And a really nice thing to do is actually get them to talk to you about their interests. And I ask the parents, what are they into? And then they tell me, and then I use that as a way of trying to draw them out, and that builds some rapport so that they feel more comfortable in the interaction. Okay, so with ADHD, how would we recognize ADHD? And it seems simple because it's in the name, right? But we're seeing a lot of ADHD, a lot of ADHD, and a lot of behaviour which overlaps with ADHD because the behaviours that you see, the inattentiveness and hyperactivity, impulsivity that you get with ADHD can stem from lots of things. It can stem from deprivation, it can stem from anxiety, it can stem from lack of sleep and using devices really late at night. It can stem from trauma, the family unit and family dysfunction, upheaval. So given the disruption that we've had over the last few years, we're now seeing a huge amount of behavioural stuff, and I'm sure we're seeing it because you're seeing it. And we think it's, again, under-recognised in girls and women. The presentations can be very variable. And I put this up just to give a sense of the sorts of presentations that you see with ADHD. It's not all hyperactivity. There can be an emerging learning gap. So that can be that the child is falling behind relative to their schoolmates, or it can be that the child feels like they're unable to meet their potential despite being actually really clever, and they're not getting the outcomes that they thought they would, and it's just really hard for them. It can be a really creative child who's innovative and energetic and always on the go. It can also present with irritability. It can be impulsivity, and actually talking incessantly is also a trait of ADHD, and interrupting. The child could be distractible, forgetful, and disorganised, and they could be getting blamed a lot at home and at school. Not putting in effort, that sort of thing. It can be an anxious, overwhelmed child who just avoids tasks which are too demanding, because holding to that line and using the executive functioning that they've got is really cognitively demanding for them. Okay, so referrals. So what can we say about referrals? So this is probably the most important slide that I have in my slide deck, and it shouldn't really say before referral to paediatric clinic. I mean, that would be ridiculous. But these are things to think about. This is probably before you refer and as you refer to paediatric clinic. These are the things that make up early intervention. And each one of these tasks are things that we would do in paediatric clinic or in CAMS, I would hope to, that really do make a difference for the child, that exclude other differential diagnoses. So just walk through them. And again, this is not to say that all of these things need to be ticked off before referral. That would be a huge amount of your time. But these are definitely, if you're seeing sort of patterns here, or you're pulling these things out as you refer or before you refer, that's going to help. So the first is that timely referral to early intervention providers is just as important as the medical diagnosis. So if you've got a little preschool child, and you think that they might have autism, then referring them, they've got language delay, then refer them for speech-language therapy. Just refer them directly so they get on the waiting list, because the waiting lists are really long for Ministry of Ed in Auckland at the moment. And that can be just as important as getting them in to see us, because we would want to do the same. And then by the time they've come in to see us, it might be months and months down the track, and their language delay has had, time to embed. The second thing is parenting programs. So for those children who have developmental behavioural issues, say they've got dysregulated emotions and behaviour, and you're thinking, could this be ADHD? You might find that it's triaged and a recommendation comes back to you for the family to undertake a parenting program. Now that's because in international guidelines, parenting programs are a first-line intervention, for ADHD, but also might be able to, improve the child's behaviour enough that an ADHD diagnosed, they're no longer in that sort of over that threshold. And for children who are very young, under the age of 5, these are really critical programs. They can make dramatic differences for children's behaviour, and I'm seeing that in my practice. So the ones that we would recommend are Triple P, the evidence-based ones, Triple P. Now, Triple P has an online offering as well, which is quite nice for busy families. There's also a Triple P anxiety program, which I haven't had time to take myself, but it's specifically around anxiety in children. I am hearing from some parents that it can be a bit technical, but I think that's a good offering to think about. Also, Incredible Years, lots of different providers for Incredible Years. That's a very good parenting program. For children who are under the age of 5, I'd also recommend, if you're seeing emotional dysregulation, Circle of Security. This is a very nice program that focuses around attachment and nurturing care in the early years. And if that bit's right, parents who've done parenting programs and they say things like, it made parenting easier. And that has a huge difference on home life and parental well-being as well. The barriers to parenting programs are obviously they're intensive. Families have to be organised enough to get there and have the capacity to do it and to implement what they're hearing. And there can be costs as well. I think the costs were alleviated during the pandemic, but now there are small costs involved. But if you can make a recommendation to a family to do a parenting program, that is very helpful. And then if a family has already done a parenting program, put that in the referral, because that is very helpful information for us. Now, the third is referral for audiology and or vision testing. Perhaps they haven't had a before school check done. But again, language delay, if you're referring for any kind of behavioural or developmental issue, the child will need a hearing check if they haven't had one recently. And vision testing if the child's having difficulties, there's a learning gap at school. Another one is sleep. So if the parents have mentioned about sleep, or maybe it's a good idea to ask as well if you're seeing behaviour in children, improving sleep makes a huge difference. For young people who've got autism, it reduces anxiety. And it improves their ability to cope so much more. It also just improves family functioning and well-being. And for children who've got ADHD, it's obvious benefits to trying to improve sleep as well. The last one is that we recommend the family connects with the school SENCO or the ECE head teacher so that they can get educational inputs in place. So these are the sorts of things which, as you refer, before you refer, they make a real difference. And if you've done these things, please put them in your referral, because it just elevates it for us to think, okay, here is a child where there has been a concerted attempt in the community to overcome this behaviour, and they're not overcoming it with all these standard things. We really need to see them. So I asked various, different colleagues, because the health pathways have one way of presenting the referral pathways, but I asked colleagues about, how does it work? And autism and ADHD, which services are accepting what? And it is so variable across the country. Thank you. So in each area, even across Auckland Metro, it varies. And my hope is that under our new Te Whatu Ora structure, we will be able to standardise the way that this happens. But what has happened is that various services, district by district, have been commissioned to provide different kind of services, and each of them have different ways of having, referral criteria, basically. And this has led to a patchwork quilt of referral pathways, which I acknowledge is really unhelpful for you. And the thing that I'd like to say here is that we are going to work on this and try and get, at least across the northern region, better standardization, but this is going to take time. So in the meantime, what can we say about this? Well, one thing that is very helpful is the developmental school report, and that is linked to on the health pathways. So when you go in and you look at any of the developmental behavioural pathways for children and young people, it will have a link to the developmental school report, and you can print that off and give it to the family to give to the school to get back to us, or you can attach it to your referral. Now, I know that is another layer to ask of you and of families. But when it is done, it is incredibly helpful, because what it does is it paints a picture of the functional impact on that child, and the functional impact might be the most important thing that we're looking at when we're triaging a referral. But it also helps us differentiate out which service the child should be going to, general paediatrics, CAMS, or developmental paediatrics. So I just encourage you to use that pro forma. And other helpful information that we look at on referrals is this behaviour that you're seeing, particularly with ADHD, is it pervasive across all settings, or is it just school or just home? And what has been tried? So if they've tried parenting programs, whether the school is involved, whether they're working with this child, whether there's a referral to an RTLB, etc. The impacts on the child, care and protection issues, and any mental health issues. And then lastly, whether there's been a significant developmental regression, because that would really alter the way that referral is looked at. So if the child is regressed in their language and they're losing skills, or they're losing skills across more than one area, then that's more of an emergency. Finally, this is, I've just got some websites here which provide very good and trustworthy information on autism and ADHD. So the first is Kids Health, written by New Zealand paediatricians, and the Autism Takiwatanga page is like a landing page with lots of links to other things. The second one is TKI Inclusive Education, which is Ministry of Ed. That is really helpful. The third is the Raising Children website from Australian paediatricians. This also has information on sleep and nutrition. And then the last one, I just point to the CDC developmental milestones. They're grouped by age and give you a sense of what is the expectation for children typically developing at each age, and you can have it as kind of a bookmark on your browser. If you're not sure what you're seeing, especially in young children, and you don't know whether thresholds for referral have been met, then our recommendation would be to ask the family to come back and see you in 10 weeks' time, give them some pointers about sleep, optimise sleep, try and get better boundary setting at home, recommend looking at parenting issues and parenting programs, and then maybe see them back in 10 weeks. And again, put that in the referral if you've done that, because that's really helpful. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your work.